So this past week in your reading plan, it was the Gospel of Matthew. We had kind of a break with reading short books, but Matthew's chapters are pretty lengthy, or pretty long. There are some chapters that have like 60 plus verses in them. Well, if not, I'm going to go ahead and show you. I'm going to share my screen with you all and explain the Gospel of Matthew just quickly. I didn't do every slide for, I didn't do a lot of slides for the whole book, but I just wanted to get some of the main idea out of it, just so we can have a real understanding about the Gospel of Matthew. It tells four things. There are four Gospels. We also read through Mark. We would have talked about Mark last Monday, but I'd canceled. But each Gospel, there's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So it's really about the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Anytime you hear the word gospel, we're talking about that. Specifically about the books, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we're talking about the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Those are the books that tell us about those things. When we mention gospels, we're talking about that. When we talk about the gospel, this is the gospel. We're preaching about it. We're referencing the entirety of the Bible story that's centrally focused on Jesus's life, death, and resurrection. So Matthew is no different. It focuses on Jesus's life, death, and resurrection. Why did Matthew write the gospel? Matthew wrote it because Jesus is the promised Messiah. He wanted to validate that. Jesus is the true King of Israel from the line of David. Jesus is the fulfillment of God's promises to Abraham. He also wanted to encourage Jewish Christians experiencing opposition and to show how God's plan of salvation includes Gentiles. So now the theme of Messiah is an important theme in the Bible. So what does Messiah mean? I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing there. Okay, Messiah. I want to talk about what the Messiah is. This is a really important theme for all of you to understand, especially when it comes to understanding the Bible. In the Old Testament, there was what's called a messianic hope. And the messianic hope was there was going to be a Messiah. Messiah means anointed one. In the Old Testament, it was called the Mashiach. That was the Hebrew word for Messiah. In the New Testament, we get Christos, and that means Christ in Greek. But Jesus's last name is not Christ. Christ is his title, that means Messiah. The messianic hope from the Old Testament that continued on and was fulfilled in the New Testament was starting with Abraham. God had promised that there would be a person that would come from Abraham. Abraham was supposed to be a blessing to all nations. And that promise would be fulfilled in this Messiah figure, that whoever the Messiah is would be a blessing to all nations and would come from Israel, would come from Abraham. Furthermore, there was supposed to be a king that would establish a reign forever, peace, blessings for all nations, and that would be the king. So really the Messiah was an anointed one, a chosen one by God, who was to establish peace in Israel, to be a king in Israel, and to be a blessing for all nations. Now Matthew's writing this gospel to prove to everybody who reads his gospel, that Jesus is in fact that Messiah. So Jews today who reject Jesus are missing out on the promise of the Messiah, missing out on the fulfillment of the Messiah, the one who's supposed to be a blessing to all nations. They miss out on this. In fact, most Jews are still awaiting a Messiah figure. They're still hoping that the Messiah comes and establishes a political reign. So in the Gospel of Matthew, you will see sometimes Jesus telling people, don't tell people who I am. Don't tell people that I am the Messiah. Don't tell people that I healed you. He'll say that like earlier in the Gospel of Matthew. That's what's called the messianic secret, the secret revealing of Jesus as being Messiah. He didn't want people to know at that time. Why? Because it wasn't his time to be known publicly as the Messiah. Eventually, the word got out that the Messiah is healing people, that the Messiah is here. But Jesus wasn't ready for that time to occur because people wanted and expected Jesus to be a political figure. They wanted him to be a person who overthrew Rome, established a kingdom, and overthrew the entire Roman government, and liberated Jewish people in Israel forever and made them free, no longer under Roman rule. But that's not what Jesus came to do. The Jews missed it. Jesus came as the Messiah to serve, to point us to God, to conquer our biggest enemy, sin. But in his second coming, which is alluded to in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus will come and establish peace physically on this earth. He will establish his reign forever physically. His kingdom will be here physically. It's here spiritually. He comes and talks about the kingdom, which we'll talk about in a few moments. But it's not here completely yet, because heaven and earth are not present here together. But this happens when Jesus comes again. It means anointed one, Mashiach is the Hebrew, Christos is the Greek. Throughout the Old Testament, there is a messianic hope that God would fulfill his promises to Abraham through a king from the line of David that would bring God's blessing to the nations of the world and establish peace and rule as Israel's king. Matthew chapter 1 and 2 are really important to Matthew's idea of what he's trying to communicate, that Jesus is the Messiah, Jesus is the King. There's a long list of names in Matthew's gospel. Now, if you can, let's go ahead and go to Matthew chapter 1. If you have your Bibles, go ahead and go to Matthew chapter 1 with me, and we'll talk about a little bit about the genealogy of Matthew so that we can have a better understanding about who Jesus is and what Matthew's trying to do. Can someone read just the first verse?
The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham.
Great. So Matthew right off the bat tells us what he's trying to do, communicate that Jesus is the son of David, son of Abraham. Remember, the messianic hope was that that the Messiah would be a fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham, which is to be a blessing to all nations, and a son of David. David was Israel's greatest king. And so Matthew's saying that Jesus fulfills the kingly line of David. He is the rightful king. He is the blessing to all nations from Abraham. And then it says genealogy, right? It's your family tree. You know, it's what's different for us in our culture today. We go to a job interview and we provide our resume, but in ancient history, it mattered who you came from, who your family line is. Whoever your family was, whoever your dad is, meant you had a reputation. You had a reputation to uphold. And so what Matthew's doing is he's trying to say that Jesus fits the job description of being the Messiah. All those names are important to showing and proving that Jesus is the Messiah. They're all important to validating his messiahship. He's the one that we've been waiting for. Matthew saying he is here. All of our hopes from the Old Testament, the Messiah is here. It's fulfilled in Jesus. What's also important, though, that Matthew's doing is that in the Greek, the book of genealogy it's translated the Genesis. So what Matthew is doing is he's saying the first book of the Bible is Genesis. Jesus coming, he brings about a new Genesis. This is a new story. God's doing something new in the world. And through Jesus comes about new creation. So Matthew's telling us that as well. In Jesus, new creation begins. A new beginning is ushered in Jesus, rightful King that has come. And then if you go down to verse 21, which is really good. It's part of the Christmas story, but it's important for us to talk about as well. Verse 20, can someone read verse 21 through 23? I want to draw your attention to Jesus' name. It means God saves. That's what Jesus' name is. And then he's also called Emmanuel, God with us. But verse 21 is interesting because it says that Jesus came to save his people from their sins. That's important for us to recognize. Because often it's believed that Jesus came to save every single person, that Jesus died for every single person who have ever existed. But Matthew chapter 1, verse 21 says that Jesus came to save his people from their sins. And how do I become part of his people? Like this is, Jesus came specifically for ethnic Israel, but I'm not a Jewish person. Most of us here are Mexican American. How do I be a part of his people? It's only by faith. Who are Jesus's people? Those who believe in Jesus by faith. He came to save those people from their sins. Now, if Jesus came and died for every single person who have ever existed, and Jesus's death forgives sins, therefore no one should be in hell because Jesus died to forgive them of their sins. And the reason why people go to hell is because they don't believe in Jesus, but unbelief is still a sin that Jesus should have died to forgive. Yet Jesus only comes to save his people from their sins. And so the question for everybody is, am I part of the people that he came to save? And if you believe in Jesus by faith, then you are included in the people that Jesus came to save. You brought up an excellent question, Vince, because you're referring to actually in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew's Gospel, in Matthew chapter 7, which we're going to look at in depthly in a few moments. But in that, you referenced a specific passage that Jesus says, and this is at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, right before he talks about building your house on the rock. Right before that, he talks about false prophets who will say, Lord, Lord, didn't we do good works in your name? And Jesus says, depart from me, I never knew you. Specifically, he's talking about false prophets, people who profess to believe in Jesus. They're trying to teach the Bible, but they don't actually have a saving relationship with Jesus because they're depending upon their own works. So we'll never get to heaven based upon depending upon our own works, even if we say we profess to believe in Jesus. The problem with the false prophets and the false teachers is that they denied Jesus. They didn't truly believe in him. They taught contrary to him, and they didn't trust in him. They trusted in their own works. They're like, here are all my works, God. God says it's not going to work that way. You have to believe in Jesus. As a result, as we covered in Ephesians chapter 2 in the past, we're saved through faith, not of works, but we were created for good works that he prepared for in advance. So salvation begins when we place our faith in Jesus. We're saved, and as a result, God imparts his Spirit to us so that we can do good works. But we're not saved by the good works, but it is evidence that we are saved. So in Matthew chapter 7, which we'll look at in a few moments, Jesus never knew those people because they were depending upon their own works to justify them before God. They weren't depending upon trusting in Jesus. And we'll look at that in a few moments, but good question, Vince. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again as we continue to look at Matthew's Gospel. Here's the outline of Matthew's Gospel. You got the arrival in history of Jesus the Messiah. John the Baptist prepares for the appearance of the Messianic kingdom. Jesus came and he established his spiritual kingdom. Jesus the Messiah begins to advance the kingdom. The authoritative message of Messiah, the kingdom, continues. Jesus shows his power in Matthew 8 and his authority. And then you get to Matthew 11, he starts experiencing a lot of opposition from Pharisees, the scribes, teachers of law that don't like him. And then in Matthew 13, you get some parables. And then Jesus reveals who he is in Matthew 13 through 16, that he is the Messiah. Matthew 16, you get the idea that he's actually going to suffer. And then in Matthew 21, we get Jesus going to Jerusalem. And then Matthew 24 through 25, we get the passion story, the crucifixion of Jesus. In the Matthew 26, he's finally crucified. And then in Matthew 28, we get the resurrection and his disciples being sent out to fulfill the Great Commission, to go get disciples, to go tell people about him. And specifically in Matthew's gospel, in verse 3 and 4, I want to draw your attention to that specifically. Now, there are some important things that I wanted to mention as it relates to the baptism, as it relates to the temptation of Jesus. What Matthew's doing in a lot of ways is trying to show that Jesus is a better Israel, and he's greater than Moses. So Moses led his people through the waters, through the parting of the Red Sea, and then they entered into the wilderness. Similarly, Jesus is baptized. He's baptized, and here's an excellent part. Matthew chapter 3 is excellent, where we see the Trinity. We see Jesus in the water, the Son in the water, the Father speaking, "This is my beloved Son." And then we have the Spirit of God descending like on Jesus as a dove. Excellent example for the Trinity, or excellent text to support the Trinity. If you ever want to reference it, Matthew's gospel in Matthew chapter 3 is a good part. And then in Matthew chapter 4, Jesus is baptized, and then he's immediately sent into the wilderness. Now, why does that matter? Because after the Exodus, in the book of Exodus, God rescues his people from the slavery of Pharaoh in Egypt, and they go into the wilderness to wander, and they're tested. Their faith is tested. God wants them to trust him, but Israel grumbles and is angry with God, not having a good time with God, complaining a lot, and continually failing tests that God has given them. But Jesus comes after the water, after being baptized, he goes into the wilderness as the true Israel, and he's tempted by the enemy, specifically the devil himself. And Jesus is victorious. He does not fall to temptation, but he overcomes the temptation in the wilderness, and he shows that he is better than Israel, and he's a fulfillment of the Old Testament. Matthew's trying to show us all of these things. As Israel was tempted in the wilderness when they left Pharaoh and Egypt in slavery, so Jesus is the better one who succeeded and did not fail the test of being tempted, but obeyed God perfectly and fulfilled God's commands for him in obedience to him. So those are important things to catch. Another thing that I wanted to show you, as we're going to get into the Sermon on the Mount, I'm going to recap the Sermon on the Mount here, and we got, here's Matthew 3 and 4. You got the baptism, the temptation, the announcement that he's king, and then he calls the first disciples. You get the call of Peter, James, and John. And now we're on the Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount is the greatest sermon that's ever been preached. It's Jesus' most famous sermon. And it's 3 chapters. You get the blessings, they're often called the Beatitudes, and then you get that we're the salt and light of the world, and then you get a short little passage about Jesus coming to fulfill the law, and then he talks about anger, he talks about lust, divorce, oaths, retaliating against people, loving your enemies, and then in chapter 6, you get his principles giving to the needy, you get how to pray in the Lord's Prayer, you get the importance of fasting, storing up our treasures not in this life but in heaven. And then he gives a long passage about anxiety, and many of us deal with anxiety. Matthew's gospel, specifically here in the Sermon on the Mount, deals with that head on. Then he gives a passage about judging. He tells you to ask God, because God gives to us who ask him. Then we learn about the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, which is just a principle to love your neighbor as yourself. And then we get trees and their fruit. And then we get the passage that Vince just brought up, depart from me, never knew you. And then we get that last passage about building your house on the rock when the storms come. So I want us to go to the Sermon on the Mount, and I want us to kind of dive into it for the last half hour and talk with you all about the Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount begins in Matthew chapter 5, and we'll kind of just work our way through that. And while you're getting there, I do want to illustrate to you that Jesus is going to recap a lot of Old Testament things, and he's going to give his interpretation on Old Testament laws, which is very similar to what Moses did. God gave Moses the 10 Commandments. God gave Moses the law on Mount Sinai. And what Moses then does is he turns and he gives the law to the people, to Israel. So this passage is called the Sermon on the Mount. It most likely wasn't on a mountain. It most likely was on a hill. There weren't like really big mountains in Israel at this time. So it's most likely like a hill. In Luke's gospel, it's called the Sermon on the Plain. So it really wasn't like a mountain. But what Matthew's trying to do is saying that as Moses did this for Israel, so Jesus is doing this in the New Testament, in the New Covenant. He gives us God's law, and he interprets God's law in this passage. What's great about this passage is it tells us blessed is another word for happy, joyful. These are blessings that if you do these things, you will be blessed. You will have happiness and you will have peace. And it begins in verse 3, happy, blessed are the poor in spirit. Being poor in spirit is recognizing your desperate need for God. If you recognize your desperate need for God, the kingdom of heaven belongs to you. And then you get to verse 4, blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. You ever been to a funeral or ever been sad over someone who's died? You ever gone grieving, and then maybe even at a funeral, someone will say to you, don't cry for this person because we know where this person's at. That's not really like what the Bible teaches us. The Bible doesn't teach us that we shouldn't cry for people who die, but it says blessed are those who mourn. But as Christians, as people who follow Jesus, we don't mourn without any hope. We mourn, but with hope. For anyone who put their faith and trust in Christ, if they died, they're going to be with God. But he's not saying that we don't cry, and he's not saying we don't grieve. In fact, it's healthy to do those things. So when people at funerals say, don't cry for this person, I'm like, it kind of irks me, because I don't know why they would say that, because God's okay with us mourning. And not just okay with it, he also comforts us in it. It's a time for him to give us comfort. And that's also connected to the being poor in spirit thing, recognizing your need for God. And when you recognize your need for God, even when you're mourning, he comes and comforts you. Then verse 5 says, blessed are the meek. They're going to inherit the earth. What does it mean to look meek? What do you think about that? What does it mean to look meek? Yeah, those are all synonyms for meekness. Meekness is a position of humility. It's not a position of arrogance. It's really the opposite of arrogance. Many times when we hear Jesus being meek, some people think that means that Jesus was just a super sensitive guy, but that's not what it means. Meekness doesn't mean sensitivity. Meekness means humility and not being arrogant, but having a quiet disposition, and not always being aggressive, but able to handle themselves, practicing self-control and handling themselves in a humble and kind manner. For those who are meek, they inherit the earth. And then it says, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be satisfied. What does that mean? What does it mean to hunger and thirst for righteousness? It's to desire God's will. Righteousness is one of those words that we talk about often, and it means right living, right standing before God and right living. Happy are the ones, blessed are the ones who hunger and want to do the will of God. They are going to be blessed. Blessed are the ones who hunger, desire God's will for their lives. And then you get blessed are the merciful, they'll receive mercy. If you are merciful, forgiving others, even if they've wronged you, and you're not punishing them right away, giving them mercy, God extends mercy to us. And then it says, blessed are the pure in heart. It means not to be evil, to have authentic intentions, not sinful intentions, to be humble, as we previously talked about, to have good intentions of wanting to please God. All these are connected to each other. And if you have a pure heart, Jesus promises you that you will see God. The problem with the world is that we don't have pure hearts. Romans chapter 3, as we've read in the past, no one seeks for God. No one is good. We're all unrighteous. Being born as sinners, we all need a new heart. So in order to have a pure heart, we need to be born again. And Jesus says in John chapter 3, that unless you're born again, you can't enter the kingdom of heaven. So we need to be born again, be made new, be made alive. And as a result, God gives us a new heart. And now we can walk in his commands and be pure in heart. And we will see God. And then you get blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be sons of God. We should not always be the people who are confrontational. We should not always be the people that are pick fights, but God's people, the way of Jesus is to be the peacemakers. They will be called sons of God. And then blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sakes, for theirs is the kingdom. Not everyone's going to like you for following Jesus. Not everyone's going to like you for doing what's right. But Jesus says, blessed are you. And then we get to 13 through 16. We're called to give the world some flavor. That's what salt does. Salt gives flavor, and Jesus's people give the world flavor. When Christians aren't being salt, then we're not giving the world flavor, and we're not preserving the faith. And light means that we stand out. If you are a Christian, it should be notable. People should recognize that you are a Christian. If you're blending in with everybody else who's not a Christian and living your life however you'd like, then you're covering your lamp and you're not letting it shine. The idea there is to stand out, not to blend in with everybody else. This is the call for the Christian. And then you get to verse 17 through 20. So the whole Old Testament is a culmination of the law, the writings, the wisdom literature, and the prophets. There are a lot of commands in the Old Testament, and the God's commands are good. And Jesus here in the Sermon on the Mount is going to be interpreting God's commands and is going to be explaining it to these people. So he prefaces this by saying, look, I'm about to explain these commands to you, but don't think that I came to abolish those things. Like all those laws that God, I didn't come to abolish them yet. I came to be the fulfillment of those things. All those laws, all those ways that God gave you, they are all fulfilled in me. I am the perfect one. I am the one who lived perfectly. I'm the one who's going to live perfectly at this particular time in the Gospels. He's living perfectly without sin. He's obeying all the commands. They're all fulfilling in him, which is good news for us as Gentiles who don't participate in the Jewish festivals, who don't have like a Seder dinner, who don't celebrate Hanukkah, which isn't part of the law, which isn't part of the Old Testament law, which is different. It's just another holiday. But we don't celebrate those things. That's not our culture. We're Gentiles. We celebrate different things. Cinco de Mayo, like there's different holidays that we celebrate because we're not Jews. But Jesus came to fulfill all of those holidays, all of those laws. And then what's interesting here in verse 20, Jesus says, I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. This is important for us to catch because, again, righteousness means right standing before God, right living. Jesus is saying, unless your righteousness, your right living, your right standing exceeds that of the teachers, the best teachers of the day, people who memorize the Old Testament, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven, which is scary because, maybe some of us have memorized only like a few Bible verses, right? And the Pharisees were teaching people the Bible, and they had like the whole Old Testament, specifically the first 5 books of the Bible, memorized. They're righteous people. Eventually, they become enemies of Jesus, but they're really righteous people for how they lived their life and how they taught people. Jesus says, you will not get into the kingdom of heaven unless you are better than them, unless you are better at living than them. Yikes, because we're not that, which is also why we need a perfect righteousness that comes from faith in Jesus who fulfilled the law. Because we can't become more righteous, but we, by faith, receive Christ's righteousness, who is more righteous than the scribes and the Pharisees. We'll keep going in the Sermon on the Mount. Now we're talking about anger. Jesus says, you have heard that it was said. So he's refuting a cultural belief system. You have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment. But I say to you that everyone who's angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council. And whoever says you fool will be liable to the hells of fire. So you're offering your gift at the altar. And then remember that your brother has something against you. Leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother, then come and offer your gift. Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you're going to court with them, lest your accuser hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the guard, and be put in prison. Truly, I say to you, you will never get out until you have paid the last penny. Jesus is talking about being angry against your brother unrighteously, unjustly, just being upset and angry, hating your brother. In other words, not as a family member, but maybe someone close to you, and just not liking them unjustly. That's not what we're supposed to do. That's not the way of Christ. Not saying that it's okay to be angry, as we read in the past, but you shouldn't be angry unjustly. And now we get this issue of lust. Verse 27. You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out, throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than your whole body be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than your whole body to go into hell. What is adultery?
Adultery is...
Isn't it like cheating?
Yeah, there. I was going to say that. Adultery is cheating on your
Sorry.
spouse.
Cheating. Yes, it's being
having,
unfaithful. Yes, adultery is being unfaithful to your spouse. Yes. Jesus escalates that, though. He says adultery is not just cheating on your spouse. He goes further and says lust. Now, what is lust? Attraction is an element that it could go into lust. So there's a distinction between being attracted to someone, finding someone, yeah, that person, God made that person beautiful, that God made this person good looking.
What about saying inappropriate things? Is that kind of...
Lusting can go about saying inappropriate things, but lusting is, in essence, seeing the attraction of somebody and wanting to sleep with them who's not your spouse, who's not your wife or your husband. That's what lust is. It's seeing someone, thinking dirty about them, wanting to actually participate in sexual acts with them. That's what lust is. So Jesus is saying, if you look at a woman, and for women, if you look at a man and you lust after him, you think that you want to have sex with him, you want to do dirty things with him, you've committed adultery with him in your heart. And Jesus directly associates this with the eyes. Our eyes are causing us to do these things. The first look, if you see someone who walks by and you just, oh, okay, that's, that person was attractive. It's really the second look. It's that more of a deep look. It's that neck turn, and then you're just gazing. That's part of that's being lustful. Jesus is saying, take your right eye and throw it out. It's better to go into heaven with one eye than it is to go into hell with both eyes. The principle is whatever is causing you to sin, this issue of lust, you need to break it off. And for many people, it's pornography, but people don't want to be accountable and don't want help with those things. And so they just go with the flow and they just like it and they just keep it. But Jesus is continually hammering on this. In the New Testament, as we're reading, we're getting this idea of sexual immorality all the time, right? Like in every single book that we've read for the last 2 months, there has been a mention in at least one of those books about sexual immorality and lustfulness. And Jesus warns us about the dangers, about hell. And he wants people to be in a right relationship with him. Then he goes to divorce, talks about divorce. Marriage is supposed to be for life, one man, one woman for life. It's not supposed to be broken. It's supposed to be a covenant. Then we get loving your enemies. I want to go to verse 43. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor, hate your enemy. People say, love the people who are next to you, but hate people who don't like you. Jesus says, I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. If you have disdain for someone, like in your heart, it's building, Jesus is telling you to bless them, to pray for them, pray for their well-being, love your enemies. Maybe you didn't make them your enemy. Maybe they just don't like you. Even if they don't like you, you're not supposed to treat them disrespectfully. You're supposed to love them, bless them, and pray for them so that they would come to know Jesus. And then I want to go to the Lord's Prayer, an excellent passage to memorize. A lot of the Sermon on the Mount is really important for us to memorize as Christians. But this is a passage that people teach their kids. I would encourage you to pray this over your kids. I pray this over my son every night before bed, and I say this prayer to him when he asks me to go in there and pray with him. I say this prayer. Could someone read verse 9 through 15? The Lord's Prayer.
Can I do that? Okay.
Real quick, explaining this is a good prayer to pray. If you want to pray this verse every day, that's great. Sometimes it's associated with Catholicism. Like, I don't want to pray prayers that are just so written out. But this is Scripture. It's good to pray this out. Jesus told us to pray this way. Of course, you don't have to, but it's good to memorize because it's God's word. He begins by saying, "Our Father." It's a communal prayer. Hallowed, holy is your name, God. Your kingdom come, your will be done. It's asking for God's will to be done on this earth. As it's done in heaven, God, may your will be done on earth. May your will be done in my family. May your will be done in wherever I go in my life. And then 11, give us this day our daily bread. Give us what we need every day, Lord. Give us our necessities as you said you would. Forgive us our debts. When we've sinned, Lord, forgive us. And help us to forgive those who wronged us. And then lead us not into temptation. Lord, when we are tempted, deliver us from evil, that we may flee but not dwell in it. Now, I want to go to, I would love to talk about anxiety, but if you want, you can recap that. But I want to go to chapter 7 and talk about the passage that Vince brought up, specifically in verse 15. And then we'll talk about the very end, building your house on the rock. Verse 15 says, "Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves." In other words, beware of people who profess to be followers of Jesus or who act like they believe in God, but they're wolves. They come to devour people. You will recognize them by their fruits. Are grapes gathered from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? In other words, you will know that they are followers of Jesus based upon the way that they live their life. So every healthy tree bears good fruit, but the diseased tree bears bad fruit. A healthy tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor a diseased tree bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down, thrown to the fire. Thus you will recognize them by their fruits. Fruits are how we live our life. You will recognize people who follow Jesus based upon the way they live their lives. You will recognize false prophets, people who are false teachers, based upon the way that they live their life. Sure, they say, "I believe in God," or they teach about God, but you will know that they're legitimately Christians by the way that they live their life. And then verse 21. So we get this connection. It was about false prophets, and now we're getting into this continued connection. "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. On that day, many will say to me, 'Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, cast out demons in your name, and do many mighty works in your name?' And then I will declare to them, 'I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness.'" These are people who had a profession of believing in Jesus, were depending upon their works, but were actually disobedient to God. They actually never had saving faith to begin with. They were just wolves. These were false teachers who professed to believe in God. They did works in God's names, but Jesus did not know them. They did not have a right relationship with Jesus, a saving relationship with Jesus. And then we get the very last passage, a key passage for our life. "Everyone then who hears these words of mine," Jesus says, he ends his sermon, says, "them and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell, floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house. But it did not fall because it had been founded on the rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain fell, the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell, and great was the fall of it. This has two applications. First application is there will be storms in our life that come. And if you built your house on Jesus, you won't fall, you won't go with the storm, but that you will stand firm and you will be able to withstand the storm. The second application is also that there will be a day that comes, destruction comes. There will be a final day of a storm coming. The world will be destroyed, but everyone who built their house on Jesus, the rock, they will be saved. Like when Noah built his ark and jumped on the boat and trusted in God. The world was just destroyed. A storm came, but Noah and his family were saved because they believed in God. Anyone who builds their house on the rock is saved when the storm comes. And anyone who does not, the consequence though, then you get a second party, people who don't. They are like the foolish people, building their house on sands, building their house on things that won't be stable when the problems of life comes. They won't be able to stand. They'll fall. They'll go away with the storm. And then finally, when the final day comes, when the Lord returns, storm comes, destruction comes, they won't be able to stand because they built their house on the sand, and they'll be wiped away. And that is the Sermon on the Mount, as briefly as we could cover it. Thanks for checking out the video today. Feel free to ask any question you want in the comments section below, or you can simply comment and provide your perspective. Also, don't forget to like this video so that it'll boost up the algorithm so we can reach a broader audience, and subscribe to this channel. Feel free to check out one of these videos. I believe they'll provide value to your life as well. And I'll see you next time.